I think the Senate committee did a real disservice to all Canadians by not sending this bill back as much better as they could have done. And in fact, their amendments were quite minor. So you may have seen news reports saying that the Senate has been going soft on crime, soft on small-scale marijuana producers because they've eliminated the mandatory minimum penalties for under 200 marijuana plants being grown. That's not true. A certain category of mandatory minimums, a 6-month mandatory minimum, was removed for between 5 and 200 plants grown for the purposes of trafficking. But those mandatory minimums continue to be in place, and in fact are 9-month mandatory minimums for between 1 and 200 marijuana plants produced for the purposes of trafficking if any of the aggravating factors in the legislation apply. Now, those aggravating factors are broad and can capture a great range of activity. For example, some of the aggravating factors are that you produce in a rental unit or property owned by a third party, which may possibly include Crown land. And so what you see is that if you're a renter producing, say, 30 marijuana plants for the purposes of supplying yourself and a few friends, you are now subject to a mandatory minimum sentence of 9 months incarceration. Another aggravating factor that's in fact quite pernicious is if you produce marijuana, again, under 200 plants for the purposes of trafficking, in a residential area in a way that poses a potential safety risk to members of the public. Not an actual safety risk, mind you, but a potential safety risk to members of the public. That causes me, as somebody who defends almost exclusively marijuana producers and distributors and possessors, a great deal of concern because I know that the courts are told repeatedly, I know that the police say in the media often, and the media reports uncritically all too often, that just about every form of marijuana production is inherently dangerous. They talk about the dangerous chemicals used to produce marijuana, the insecticides and fungicides and fertilizers, as if these products are not commonly used in all agricultural production and indeed by all home gardeners of any plant. There isn't anything particularly different about the insecticide you spray on your roses and the insecticide someone may spray on their 30 or 40 or 50 cannabis plants. There isn't anything particularly different about the nutrients. They are plants. They require the same nutrients as any other plants, and these things are commonly used in farms and greenhouses and homes around the country and sold at every garden nursery. Again, this is something that there's been a successful campaign waged to suggest are somehow dangerous in the hands of marijuana producers, perhaps not dangerous in your grandma's garden. So that's going to capture a lot of people. And mind you, the word potential is important. You don't have to create an actual risk of harm. It just has to be a potential risk of harm. And of course, you have this dangerous, so-called dangerous chemicals issue. You also have the phenomenon of what the police like to call our grow rips, what I think is just theft of a valuable commodity that's made valuable by prohibition. You don't see a lot of people stealing corn out of the fields, but you do see occasionally, not as much as police would have you believe, but occasionally you do see people breaking into marijuana production facilities in the attempt to steal that cannabis. Well, the police will tell you that can happen anywhere cannabis is being grown, and therefore there's a potential risk being presented. And my fear is that a lot of people are going to be captured by this legislation that don't deserve to be, and that frankly aren't the kind of people that we hear all the time. This legislation is designed to target the large-scale, sophisticated, organized crime, linked, massive producers that are importing drugs into this country or exporting drugs out of this country. Those people already face penalties far in excess of 9 months, and so really this legislation is only going to capture people that aren't its intended targets, and unfortunately that's going to be a whole lot of very small-scale marijuana producers. You may also have heard that the Senate restored discretion to have judges depart from the mandatory minimum sentences. Again, this is an inaccurate portrayal of what the Senate did. There has been some small measure of discretion returned to judges, but it is only in the case of Aboriginal offenders and only when the judge finds that the particular circumstances and facts of the offense and the offender deserve departure from the mandatory minimums. It does not apply to all offenders. It only applies to Aboriginal offenders, and that tracks existing criminal code legislation, which allows judges to take into account special circumstances surrounding Aboriginal offenders who are vastly and dramatically overrepresented currently in Canada's prison populations. And so, while I applaud the restoring of some discretion in the case of Aboriginal offenders, I wish the Senate had, in its wisdom, expanded that so that judges could get back some of the discretion that's being stripped away from them in this legislation and actually handed over to Crown Counsel. This bill hands a tremendous amount of discretion to the Crown because there's a notice provision, much like there is in some drunk driving legislation that carries mandatory minimum sentencing. In order to seek the mandatory minimum sentence, the Crown must provide notice to the accused that the Crown's going to seek the mandatory minimums and attempt to prove the aggravating factors. Failure to give that notice means the mandatory minimums do not apply. And so a Crown can choose or not choose to give that notice. That authority is obviously constrained by policies of the Department of Public Prosecutions and the federal DOJ, Department of Justice. But the fact of the matter is discretion is now vested in the Crown, which used to and historically has always been in the hands of judges, and that's another pernicious and very dangerous step to be taking with our criminal justice system. The final point I want to make is that there is still some time. We have an opportunity to continue to try to influence this legislation. There may be an extended back and forth between the House of Commons and the Senate of Canada. The Conservative minority government has signaled its displeasure with the amendments, putting out a press release blasting the currently Liberal-dominated Senate for being allegedly soft on crime. I think we need to tell the Liberals, look, if they're going to attack you for being soft on crime, no matter what you do, even if you support this legislation, which you did in the last go-around, you might as well take the principled stand and oppose this legislation and explain to Canadians that it's not going to achieve the goals the Conservatives say it will. In fact, it'll make things worse. All the evidence is in that direction. This bill is going to be dangerous to Canadians, and instead of being so-called tough on crime, we need to get smart on crime. We need to enact policies that will actually reduce the incidence of crime in our communities and the dangers faced by ourselves and our children. That's the bottom line, and this bill is not going to do it. In fact, this bill represents an escalation of a drug war approach that causes tremendous damage and tremendous danger in our society. And we need to stop it. We need to reverse the tide. Canada needs to get with the rest of the world, which is going in a dramatically different direction in terms of drug policy, including the United States, which for the last 30 years has led the charge for mandatory minimum sentencing. They're even backing away from it because they see what it's done to their system and to their people. So it's not too late to get involved. Please visit the website at whyprohibition.ca. That's whyprohibition.ca. We have an incredible array of tools and features that allow you to join, get involved, meet others in your local area, take action, and help us end drug prohibition, marijuana prohibition, and block the implementation of Bill C-15. Thanks very much. I'm Kirk Tousaw. This has been another edition of Legalese. Keep checking back for more updates on this legislation as it proceeds through the House of Commons.